Welcome to the section Ongoing Research, Sustainable Practice in Performance Design, Theatre Buildings and Operations by Research Commission. Welcome. We are going to wait for a couple of minutes for others to join us.
Hello. Hello, Paddy.
Hi there, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. Oh, I still have a background from the previous session. Sorry.
Nice to see you, Wan Young.
Nice to see you.
I've just had a panic trying to find the link, and I know that Andrew is also looking for the link, so I've just sent it to him.
I see here Greer Crowley. Hello, Greer.
Hi.
Just going to switch my phone off.
Hi, Paul, you're here. Wondering, hi, Paddy and Andrew are having problems getting in.
Kate, I'm here. I'm in. Andrew's in
too.
too.
Sorry. Hooray! You're there, and Andrew's there. Hooray!
Andrew is there. Yeah, Paddy's here as well.
Hi there.
That's all right. Sorry, I was just panicking for a second.
You were panicking. I was really panicking.
Yeah, I was panicking as well, but we're all here.
Phew. Okay. Good. Well, lovely to see you all, and thank you very much for everyone joining us. That's fantastic. We're in competition with 3 other commissions, so this is a wonderful array. Thank you. So should we kick off? Wan Young, is that all right? Should we go?
Yes, let's do that. Let's do that.
Thank you. So my brief introduction is that I'm here as chair of the commission, the Research Commission, and my background is as a theatre designer, curator, educator and researcher. And this is the last Research Commission session for, oh, why am I, sorry, I didn't mean to be, I'm not meaning to hide my situation.
There you go.
Sorry, we apologise. So this is our last session for the Research Commission in this OISTAT Congress, which has been a most amazing online, 5 days of online activities, which is quite extraordinary. We met lots of new people, as well as lovely to see lots of familiar faces. So the PowerPoint and the contact, please you be on mute. Thank you. The PowerPoints with contacts and links will all be on Basecamp, and then we'll edit them up slightly for the OISTAT website to just take account of safeguarding and all that sort of thing. I'm going to invite the 3 panelists that we've got to introduce themselves, but sort of in the meantime, while they're talking, please do store up questions and also instances of practice and situations which you think you'd like to put to them, that you'd like to discuss further, opportunities maybe, you know, going forward, hopefully, for us to actually work in a different way from the past. We hope to have a reasonable amount of discussion time for those questions, so yes, do store them up. So without further ado, the panelists today are fantastic. Paddy Dillon, architect and writer, who's leading the Green Book project. Andrew Wiley, engineer and partner in Borough Happold, who are the leading integrated consulting engineers and advisors. Yes, I did have to look that one up. We're delighted that Andrew is making the time to join us. Thank you. And also Paul Burgess, who I've known through the Society of British Theatre Designers and is a colleague of mine there. And Paul is theatre designer, director, artist, writer and musician, very importantly. So I think we'll go from there. Paddy, would you mind starting? And if you want to share your screen, please do, but maybe that's a bit later. Oh, you're mute, you're mute.
Very good point. I might share my screen or I might just talk. And I think for sort of 20 minutes or so, I think you said, Kate, I was just going to...
It can be shorter. The intro can be shorter.
The intro can be shorter. I'll talk a tiny bit about myself, but much more about how the Theatre Green Book project, which me and Andrew have been doing, started out, which is trying to provide theatre as a sector with a route towards more sustainable practice. But a tiny bit first about me. So I'm a theatre architect by trade, but it means that I'm working with theatres the whole time. I'm also currently interim chair of the Theatres Trust in the UK, which is one of the lead partners in the Theatre Green Book initiative. As well as that, I'm the editorial chair of the next ITIAC, International Theatre Engineering and Architecture Conference, which will happen next year. And it's lovely to see at least 2 fellow committee members on the screen as well. But it's with ITIAC that I want to start, because it was in conversations around ITIAC that the Theatre Green Book initiative really started to take shape. And so if we wind back more than a year, back to before the COVID crisis hit, and we were just starting to think about the ITIAC conference in 2022, and started to get together some groups of theatre makers just to listen to what people were talking about in theatre. What were the key conversations that any international theatre conference should be reflecting? And we brought together stage designers and directors, theatre architects like myself, theatre consultants, set builders, people who are seeing theatre from all sorts of different perspectives. We were bringing them together in groups just to talk about what mattered to them. And sustainability and the climate crisis came up time and again. And clearly there was this huge subject that was preoccupying theatre makers of all sorts. But what everybody was saying, what everybody was expressing, was a sense of frustration that despite the fact that we all know the severity of the crisis, despite the fact that theatre makers have been talking about this for a long time, the sector as a whole has not yet moved, or hadn't then yet moved towards more sustainable practice. And then COVID struck, and we all found ourselves, instead of working, instead of making productions, everybody was sitting at home looking at Zoom screens like this one. And I brought together a group in must be one of the first Zoom calls I did. None of us had heard of Zoom before, just to talk about this and why it was such a problem. And Andrew came together on that group, and we had a couple of production managers and technical directors, and I think there was a stage designer there, I can't remember. Just to say, why is it so hard? We all know there's a crisis. We don't need to be told that. We all want to work in more sustainable ways. So why is it so hard to do? Now, it was on that call that we quite sort of immediately said, okay, let's divide this challenge into 3 headings. We need to make sure that theatre productions are more sustainable. We need to make sure that our theatre buildings are more sustainable. And we need to make sure that everything else that theatres do, whether it's running foyers, front of house, catering, or whether it's running workshops or rehearsals or dressing rooms, need to be more sustainable as well. And those three headings have become the 3 volumes of the Theatre Green Book, which Andrew and I will talk about a little bit later. But it was the first one, how to make productions more sustainable, that we really started to engage with. And there was something very telling that somebody said in one of those early conversations, which is, it feels as if we're all waiting for something to be invented. And yet we all knew, from talking to Andrew and his sustainability team at Bureau Happold, I knew that actually there's no fantastic piece of engineering that's going to solve this. We all know what we need to do. It's use less resource and use less energy and reuse and recycle more. And it became clear that the blocker was just in the way we all work when we make shows. And it was from that starting point that the Theatre Green Book started to take shape as an initiative. And because I was closely connected with both the Theatres Trust in the UK and another of the big theatre organisations called the Sbtd, which some of you may know, and they publish guidance for health and safety, how to run theatres safely without accidents. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could have guidance for sustainability, which in the same way everybody followed, everybody knew it by heart, everybody had it as part of their practice, so that you don't need to think about sustainability. It's just a normal part of your work. And we started to think through, how would we put together guidance of that sort? And we realized 2 or 3 things. The first is that it had to come from theatre makers. There was no point writing guidance from on high. Theatre making, as you all know far better than I do, is such an intricate, such a bespoke, such a special process. It involves so many people, from producers to designers, from set builders to directors, to wigs and hair and costume and makeup people, to lighting technicians and sound designers. It involves so many people that we had to listen to them if we were going to come up with guidance that worked. We also knew that if the guidance was going to be trusted, it needed to be based on really solid thinking, physics, engineering about sustainability. And so that's when we said, okay, the whole project needs to be underpinned by Bureau Happold, Andrew's firm, which is perhaps the leading firm of engineers in the world for sustainability engineering. They've worked with loads of different sectors and cities and companies and people to come up with sustainability guidance, and we need their thinking to underpin the whole project. So that gave us a process. We were going to bring together theatre makers of all kinds, designers, directors, producers, and put them together with Andrew's team of sustainability consultants and experts, so that we could understand what the challenges were and work out what the guidance needed to say. That was the first thing. I think the second thing we realized was that there was no point everybody coming up with lots of different versions of guidance. Theatre makers move from show to show, from theatre to theatre, from company to company, and often from country to country. And if, say, those of you who are designers, in going to work with a new theatre, learn a whole new system of sustainability, new standards, new rules, new practices, then everybody would be thinking about sustainability the whole time and would have no time to do their work. So we needed to come up with common guidance that everybody could share. So the first thing we did was bring together all of the theatre groupings in the United Kingdom. I've named some of the organisations that are partners in this. Others of you will have heard of Julie's Bicycle, who've been brilliant pioneers. We've brought in the Society of British Theatre Designers, the Association of Lighting Designers. We brought in the Scottish sustainability groups and all of the membership bodies for theatres around the UK, so that we were all doing this together. And it's been a shared initiative from all of us to come up with this guidance. I think the last thing we realised is that, and again, I'm stating the obvious here, theatre is incredibly broad as a sector. And when I say theatre, I'm also talking about dance and opera and different kinds of performance. And it can vary, as you all know, from grand opera down to small touring shows, from established buildings like the National Theatre through to small companies that are putting together one show for a festival. There can be shows that involve hundreds of thousands of pounds or euros or dollars to put them together, and there can be shows that run on no budget at all. And we needed to come up with guidance that worked for everybody. And so one of the early decisions, and this was a suggestion from Andrew's team, and Andrew might talk about this later, was that we needed to come up with steps. It was no good just describing what some sort of idealistic sustainable theatre looked like. We know what that looks like. But we also needed to come up with guidance for people who are only just starting on this journey, who are still trying to make big shows, but want to do it in a sustainable way. And so that was the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle, if you like, in putting together the Green Book. I'm going to leave Andrew to talk a bit more about that process, about how we brought it together. But just to fill you in on where we are now, the Sustainable Productions, which is the first volume of the Theatre Green Book, we put it out as a trialing version a few months ago, and we've just been deluged with interest and input from theatres not only in the UK but from further afield as well, who want to start working with it and trialing it. So now all of the UK National Theatre's productions are being made to Theatre Green Book standards. All of the National Theatre of Scotland's productions are being made to these standards. So is the National Theatre of Wales. All of the major organisations for performance in the UK, the Royal Opera House, English National Opera, Scottish Opera, Glyndebourne Opera, the Royal Shakespeare Company, are starting to trial work with the Theatre Green Book. And just as importantly, we have now at least 50 small theatres doing trials. And it's really important that we stress trials, because this will only work for theatre if theatre makers are the ones who are shaping the guidance itself. If you are all using the book and then coming back to us and saying what worked and what didn't work, that's how we can come up with guidance which is really practical for you in keeping this art form alive, but moving it towards a place where we're making it in a responsible fashion. And I think before passing on, I just want to stress for a moment why I think this is so important. Because of course, anybody could say, theatre is such a small sector compared to the carbon use of the automobile industry or of aviation. Does theatre really matter? And I think our answer to that is really twofold. The first is that at the state of the crisis that we're now facing, everybody has to do everything we can if we're going to try and move towards a safer place. But the second is this, that if theatre is still relevant as an art form, then it has to be part of the conversation about the climate emergency. And if we're to be part of that conversation, then theatre has to be sustainable itself. And that's why it's essential to me, and I hope to all of us, that we keep on with this journey and find a way to make theatre truly sustainable. There, Kate, I'm going to shut up at that point and let you talk.
Yeah, that was perfect. It was a great start. Thank you so much, Paddy. Andrew, I'm going to move on to you.
Yes, thank you. Great introduction, Paddy.
Yeah.
So from me, I as Kate kindly pointed out, I'm a partner at a firm called Bureau Happold. We are consulting engineers and designers of buildings. Me specifically, I'm a structural engineer by profession, by training and background, and I've had an interest and a passion in the impact that our work has on the built environment and the environment in which we all reside. and that has led me to design quite a few timber buildings. But I've been fortunate enough to work in designing theatres for quite some time now, and therefore this challenge for an industry, for a sector, it sits in a space that I'm very familiar with, but also keen to help. I think just thinking about my career, and then thinking about as engineers, we often find ourselves, we love solving problems. We love the harder the problem, the better. There is no harder problem than the climate emergency. But often, I have worked on designing buildings where I fundamentally felt that we're starting with one hand tied behind our back because we haven't necessarily got the right brief, or the users of the building don't understand and fully appreciate how to challenge designers to make best use of their skills and solve the right problem. So reflecting on that, and then thinking of the time, as Paddy described, when we were all introduced to Zoom at the beginning of the COVID crisis, where at that time the industry which I work in, construction sector, we're all busy making declarations to say that we were going to reduce our impact and make this make the climate emergency part of the primary challenge for us as our businesses. I started talking to people in theatre, in some cases trying to suggest that declarations needed to be made for the industry, but actually the resounding feedback was, we're all bought into this. We don't need to make declarations. We need to know the how. We need to know how to go about doing this. And as Paddy described, that a bit of scratching around and a bit of focused sets of discussions really instilled in us the fact that we had contribution to make, not as theatre makers, but those as a set of engineers and consultants that really understood the issues of carbon, the issues around biodiversity loss, and the impact that our consumption had. And I think an important part of this as well was that we were, if you like, agnostic to being a particular cultural organisation. We were able to help the process and act as the conductor, act to collate and facilitate, and help everybody that participated in these workshops and the consultation, through the consultation process, to help extract out and draw and create your own industry-led guidance. And that was, I think that was really important for this to have credibility. It could not be us as engineers and consultants imposing something. It was something that needed to be practical and born out of everybody that participated in it to facilitate that buy-in. The other thing that I think was very useful, we designed lots of buildings and infrastructures, and that process of creating buildings is a collaborative one, very much like making theatre or running a theatre organisation. So the understanding and coming at this from everybody within the organisation has a role to play, and it cannot be passed on to someone else. It's something that's deep within my DNA and my colleagues' DNA. And there are processes from the design of buildings that can map across onto the sustainability guidance and response that the Theatre Green Book provides. So I think what we tried to be able to do as well in this was to make sure that no one was left thinking it's someone else. There's nothing in here that's relevant to my role, my job, whether that is that you're designing sets, you're making wigs, whether you're ordering the ice creams and bar drinks and drinks for the bar, or whether you're the person that places that manages the building, and that had to work across all scales of organisation. So what might be relevant to a theatre of a particular scale also had to be able to be interpreted and be relevant to something to a theatre of different scale. So it needed to cover everything, and everybody needed to feel as though had access to this. And hence the brilliant curation of the workshops that Paddy and the Theatres Trust managed to do, is to make sure that we had attendance from all roles represented and all scales of theatre making represented. Very, very important. I think the heroic work that my team did was then digest and organise and represent the information that was provided to us, and be ready to plug the gaps where we saw an obvious part missing. So each of the 3 volumes, as Paddy outlined, covering the productions, covering the building, the built fabric and infrastructure of theatres, and then the operations of the theatre. We tried to ensure that we had a consistent approach to the 3 volumes, and as further volumes get released, as Paddy's just described the timeline, you'll see a common approach to that. So you can, if you can access it quickly through at a glance sections, and specifically that is to give overarching concepts and if I'm taking, for example, the theatre productions, this is I'll just read to you actually, the do more with less, use more reused components and recycled materials. If it has to be new, think where it comes from. Reduce harmful chemicals, reduce travel, reduce deliveries, and make sure everything gets used again. It's that level of almost the philosophical approach to making theatre that then accesses into the detailed principles that sit behind those statements, and then the targets and the guidance. It's important that sustainability across every sector and every industry is not seen as a competitive, we're better than you, because it engenders behaviours of shortcutting meaningful progress. But it is important that it's transferable and measurable, and hence the reason for measurable guidance to measure progress. And a final thing, I'm rambling on quite a bit here, but hopefully it'll give you some thought into some background into the philosophy of developing these. Is a lot of people accessing this will see this as a Herculean task. Where do I start? I think this structure helps that, and it also helps you recognise that there is a timeline to this. We're not going to solve it perfectly tomorrow. As Paddy described, we seek feedback. As organisations, you should be looking at feedback and how can I continue to improve. So we want to be able to improve the volumes that we've published, but we also want to encourage self-reflection in anybody who's using this and is on an improvement journey, to be able to transition over time and not feel frustrated that it can't all happen yesterday. It's a natural thing to, in the face of an emergency, it's a natural thing to want to do, to have it all solved straight away. And I work with lots of colleagues that get frustrated at the pace of change, and I think that's healthy. But using this in a structured way and looking at a timeline for improvement should help you engender continued improvement and continued reduction of impact of theatre operations, buildings and productions. I think that's enough from me, but I'm sure it will engender plenty more questions, and I'm happy to go into more detail where needed.
Yeah, thank you ever so much, Andrew. It certainly will. I've got lots of questions I'm scribbling already. Paul, do you think you could introduce yourself.
Sorry, having a little unmuting drama there. Hello, fantastic to be here. Yes, so I'm going to introduce myself very briefly, and the Society of British Theatre Designers Working Group very briefly, and the EcoStage Initiative very briefly, and then, well, I hope I managed to brief, because then I'm going to talk in more detail about the various initiatives that come out of Sbtd and how EcoStage works and everything in the kind of next bit. So yes, I'm a practicing designer and various other roles in the arts, and I have been sort of doing that for a couple of decades, and I've also been involved in environmental activism for a long time. In fact, since I was a kid, and I recently walked past my old primary school and saw these huge trees and realized that some of us had planted them when we were 8 or 9, and they're now like a little woodland. Anyway, that was a rather wonderful moment. But it wasn't until recently that I like many of us, I'd been in complete denial about how to combine having a practice in the arts with caring about the environment. When the Sbtd had its exhibition at the V&A following the exhibition at Prague Quadrennial, we were organizing a series of round tables, and my studio mate, another designer, sort of pricked my conscience and said one of these round tables really needs to be on sustainability. So I kind of suggested that, realizing that the moment had come where denial was no longer possible, and if we ran this round table and started having that conversation, I was going to have to commit. And we did have the round table, and it was an incredibly exciting moment, because a lot of people were there who also wanted to commit. And it did seem like a huge challenge at that point, kind of, I think, in terms of the UK sustainable performance world, there's kind of before Green Book and after Green Book eras. And the pre-Green Book era, it all felt, like a pretty kind of huge mountain. And there were various conversations around what the designer's role in that, because we were concerned that we were going to be, we had questions about who's going to be the difficult person in the room. It felt as if one of us was going to talk about being sustainable, we were going to be, and we're quite used to being the difficult person in the room, but do we want to be even more difficult? And who's then going to carry that weight? Is the designer then going to be constantly pushing? I mean, not necessarily the designer, but if it's one individual on the team, obviously we were looking at a designer's perspective. There's one individual on the team who's trying to be green, but it's not part of the overall ethos of working at the venue or the production company. Who carries that weight? And how has that conversation started? All those sorts of things. And it seemed really obvious that we needed to set up a working group within Sbtd to try and answer those questions. There isn't, so it's a working group without a particular, or it's set up without a particular agenda. The idea is to be responsive to these questions that come along, to do whatever needs kind of doing as things come up, to support designers on their sustainability journeys, and to represent designers in forums like this and so on. So in a bit, I will talk through all the different initiatives that the group's doing, but that's the sort of essence of why that group started, and what it aims to do. And parallel to that, in 2015, there was an initiative set up called the EcoStage Pledge, set up by Andrea Carr, Tanya Beer, and Alice Holt. And the idea was that people in the performing arts who wanted to be sustainable would benefit from making a public pledge of that sustainability as a way to sort of commit and also to connect with other people who had made the pledge. That had some initial success. There was a really good set of pledges, sort of kind of principles to pledge to, and then the website kind of broke, and people couldn't pledge, and it all went to, sort of, from that point of view, everything petered out, not because of the content and the quality, but for practical reasons. And at that same round table, a few more of us, some people had left that. In fact, Andrea Carr's the only continuity right through. But Mona Castell, Ruth Stringer, and I joined with Andrea to sort of pick up on EcoStage and see what we could do with it. And the expanded version will now become much more of a hub for a kind of community of practitioners. And I think where it still has a pledge, still has these principles, but now it can host case studies, and it's got kind of various, we're developing a reading list and all those sorts of things. And I think where it sits in relation, because there's now a lot of initiatives going on, and I think where it sits is it focuses very much on individual, not necessarily just creative people, so everyone in the performing arts, but the individual journeys through kind of ethics and the artistic side, and this kind of, as I was saying, the sort of more personal journey that we take through, and providing support for that, trying to create a community for discussions around that, and hope, also sort of plugging people into all the different other initiatives that are going on. So we want to sort of fill that role, and there's a very strong emphasis in the principles on the relationship with social justice, is what, how that relates to ecological thinking. Again, I'll come back a bit to that later in this session, but that's the essence of it. Now back to me personally, I am working on projects that are all committed to be, well, stroke of luck actually, that all the producers I've worked with post-pandemic have been responsive to working sustainably. So I'm now putting my money where my mouth is and seeing how difficult or not that proves in productions I'm working on at the moment. So yes, that's me.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. Thank you. Well, you've all given the sort of wonderful, comprehensive introductions to the start of it. So I don't know whether there's stuff that you would like to sort of dive straight into, but I think I would like to ask particularly about some of the key collaborations in the Green Book project, and perhaps that's also the same as ITAC, but you mentioned the National Theatre and several others, but I think it would be really interesting to hear what their perspectives are, and how on earth the Royal Opera House and Opera Europa and people like that are sort of thinking about how they think that they could join in this, because they're such complex operations.
I think if I could pick that one up, I think the collaboration, the whole thing has been a collaborative project and a collective project, and has been respectful of and responsive to the extraordinary breadth of theatre. I think it's an important thing that right at the outset, we never went to a big theatre and said, do you want to do this? We could have gone to the National Theatre, who've done a lot of work on sustainability, and got them to develop a tool or a series of tools or whatever. But we knew that if we did that, it's human nature that all of the other big companies in the UK would not want to use it. That's natural. And we also knew that there was no one organisation that represented the whole of theatre or reflected the whole of theatre. And so it's a really important thing that the building block for the Theatre Green Book was never theatres, it was people and practitioners and theatre makers. So the focus groups that Andrew and I were putting together were of directors and stage designers and producers, and some of those producers were part of big organisations or buildings, and some of them were freelancers. All of the stage designers were freelancers, the directors were freelancers, and then we would be talking to say lighting technicians, and some of those would be connected to buildings and some wouldn't. So the conversation was always with individual theatre makers, and that enabled us to be talking to freelancers as much as we were ever talking to buildings. the buildings were important in it for two reasons. Firstly, they very generously came up with the funding to pay for the background work on the Green Book. This has been a donated project. Individuals, theatre makers of all sorts, have given their time. There was so much work to be done by Bureau Happold that we came together to provide some money for them. It doesn't begin to cover the amount of work that they've put into and donated to this project, but it was a sort of token gesture, and that came from the big theatres, among others, but mainly from the big theatres. And they never asked for anything in return. They never had editorial control. They never asked to look at a draft. It was just something they wanted to move forwards. I think the conversation and the collaboration has been really, really interesting because everybody has something to contribute here. The big theatres have data. They do lots and lots of shows, and they're doing the most difficult shows, big stage shows with high production values. If we can make those sustainably, we can make anything sustainably. And they have staff who can do, you know, detailed pieces of work and have really concentrated on different aspects of production, whereas small theatres and small companies and freelancers will tend to work alone. So they have had a lot to put into this. At the same time, all of our sessions have also included people working on a small independent scale, and they've got knowledge, because it's more or less roughly true to say that if you're working at a small scale with low budget, you're probably making very sustainable shows already, because you can't afford to put a whole load of material on stage. You can't afford to be building multiple complicated sets. And so the knowledge that they have about how to think fluently and elegantly, how to make a small amount of resource go a long way, how to reuse and recycle, is fundamental to the thinking around sustainable production. And so it's been a two-way dialogue across the different scales of theatre, and that's been really, really important. I think, Kate, you were sort of asking a question that sounded a bit sort of skeptical about opera and its role in all of this.
No, maybe.
I've been, I guess, surprised by the extent to which opera has been a real focus of energy in this. By no means the only one. You know, this has been a huge, complex coalition. There have been cities that are particularly focused. The city of Manchester in the UK has a whole group of arts organisations that have been working on sustainability for a long time. Bogota in Colombia is doing a similar thing at the moment. There have been individuals and organisations, Julie's Bicycle I've already mentioned, Creative Carbon Scotland, that have been working on this for a long time. Opera, I'm going to admit, really surprised me, and I think this is partly, there are a couple of things behind it. I think partly there happen to be a lot of individuals in opera who care about sustainability as much as we all do, and want their work to reflect that. Opera thinks for the long term. Unlike many theatres, opera stores shows and brings them back. So if you want to look at reuse and recycling, if you want to look at maximum use of a set and making sure it's shown to the most number of people, opera is exemplary in that way. Thirdly, opera companies tend to be quite well funded. And so they do have the time and the resource to be researching and thinking about how to work more sustainably. And I think finally, opera as a sector is, you know, most of their productions are co-productions, and they can only work if they tour and work across distance. And if they want to do that sustainably, they have to invest in the research and the time and the thinking that's going to make that possible. And opera is fantastically well networked internationally. I'm going to be talking, some of the rest of you may be there as well, at Opera Europa's conference this autumn about sustainability. And they've got a wonderful international network through which ideas can be shared and spread. And the message of working sustainably and how to do it can be extended. At the same time, because it's not all about big companies, far from it, you know, also at the same time, we're overwhelmed with small companies working at a small scale who are very, very committed to sustainability and want to make sure both that they're working in the best possible way and that their knowledge and expertise is coming back to us to be fed back into the Theatre Green Book. So what you mentioned, Kate, about collaboration and relationships has been at the heart of this initiative from the outset and remains absolutely at the heart of it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That's really important, isn't it? That actually fundamental to the idea of sustainability is collaboration, and that on one level it needs everybody to be doing their bit, or to agree to come together to at least discuss it or to think about it, to be a part of it. And that the idea that that can be citywide is also kind of very cheering, isn't it?
I think it is. One of the sort of first lessons we learned was when, and again, it was, I think, the first meeting we had that Andrew and I were both in, and there were two technical directors there, both of whom are very committed and have done a lot of thinking about it. And one of them said, well, you know, look, I know what sustainability looks like, what sustainable production looks like. I kind of know that it's about reuse and recycling. So we said, so could you just write down some simple rules for it? And he said, well, yeah, I could, really. And about a month later, I got in touch and said, how's that page of rules getting on? And he said, I can't do it because that's not how theatre works. And I, as a production manager, as a technical director, can't tell a director what to do. And I can't dictate to the set builder where they get the plywood from, as it were, because theatre is collaborative. And that, I think, was the primary insight for Andrew and me and the others of the team developing this, that you can only move forward if everybody knows not only what they have to do differently, but what they need to expect other people to do differently. It's not just about personal commitment, it's about systems change. And it's about changing the whole collaborative system if you want a different outcome. And that's why the guidance that we've come up with and that Bureau Happold initially developed for sustainable production is not only about hard targets. You have to make sure that 50% of your materials come from reused and recycled sources. Just as important are the ways in which you need to work differently and more collaboratively if you're going to achieve those targets. Because we know that if you work in the same way, you're going to have the outcomes we had in the past. If you want different outcomes, you have to work in new ways.
Okay, thank you. I've definitely got some questions and responses as a result of that. But first, I'd like to ask, I mean, as Andrew, does that, coming from engineering?
Yes, absolutely. And again, I reflect on process of creating buildings. I'm not saying that it's the same thing. On the what I was going to say, actually, and this is for so many things or applicable across multiple sectors and professions, but it's time to facilitate that collaboration. You have to allow time, and that your question and Paddy's response on opera, I think that was one of the things which also I learned through that, was that the lead time for shows is that much longer. They have more time to plan, and they have more time to investigate and make decisions. And if we were in designing buildings, in designing shows, we have the time. That is a really valuable resource to be able to make an impact, because you can start with a vision. You can start with a common sharing of objectives, but then you have time to investigate different ways of achieving them, not implementing the same way that you've gone about things in the past. And that is so important. I talk to my colleagues who design buildings to talk to them about the time needed to refine and to consider and to explore. And linked to that, and it's a key sort of tenet of this, is investing in people to give them the time to be able to achieve it, not in stuff. It's a key thing. If we want to have and be setting up a the process of circular economies for stuff, to underpin that, we need the time to do the research on material inventories and to find the materials to repurpose. So time and people are key to getting successful outcomes.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. That's exactly something I was going to say. But Paul, your thoughts from the designer's point of view, really?
Yeah, I think the point about collaboration being fundamental to sustainability, I kind of want to pick that up in a way, because it's such an essential part of ecological thinking. This, connectivity of everything, and it's it relates to the fact that our connection with nature is similarly essential and unavoidable, and the fact that nothing's ever really thrown away, that all these sort of connections that are there, and it also relates to a discussion that we had very early on in the Sbtd group. Well, it sort of picks up on what I said earlier about who takes responsibility, and you don't want an individual to be stuck pushing against the rest of the team. That this really only works when a whole team is involved, and it's not just a green-minded designer or a green-minded production manager. And that's why a really important part of this thing is committing. It's something that actually Paddy said in the past many times. I think it's committing right from the beginning, right from the outset to the process. I think there's a really interesting point generally in thinking about how we work in theatre. Well, generally how teams work, but how we work in theatre about advocacy. And there are these sort of traditional advocacy roles of the designer pushing for, what's going to look best and serve the play artistically, and the production manager pushing from the, law, the keeping in budget and obeying the laws of physics and all that kind of stuff. But of course, I think with trying to work in an ecologically minded way, that sort of conflictual advocacy doesn't quite work, really. I mean, it's more like sort of thinking about it more like health and safety rules or something, where it's just there, it's kind of set. We know that we have to, we know what the parameters are quite clearly. So I think that's, and I think we'll get used to that as designers. There's some interesting conversations that we've had, around the idea of compromise. Does this involve compromise? I don't think we particularly think about creating fire hazards as a compromise. I think, it's the way that we kind of accept what our parameters are. But also, I think some designers obviously want their sets to look exactly as they imagine, would have imagined without thinking about sustainability. But I think other designers, well, actually I'd include myself in this, are quite interested in letting that sustainability show a bit in the designs. Yeah, anyway, yeah, that was turning into a ramble at that point.
Yeah. Paddy. Thank you, Paul. Paddy.
Unmuting myself. While Paul was talking, I was thinking about collaboration and the way that in a hierarchy of people working together, which is not functioning well, then everybody was always trying to get a bit more control in order to try and safeguard their bit, if you see what I mean. Whereas if you're collaborating, there's another side of the coin, which is about giving up a bit of control. And that also, as long as you trust each other, and this is why with the Green Book, we're so insistent that you have to start out with everybody in the room and with everybody understanding the environmental standards you're trying to reach and everybody signing up to them, so that you trust each other. And if you do trust each other, then actually you can give up a little bit of control. And I agree with you, Paul. I think compromise is a really sort of unhelpful word, because if somebody says to you, do you want to compromise? It sounds like you're letting standards fall. And of course, that's not the inevitable consequence at all. But for example, and I think this is an example we've got in the Green Book, one of the reasons to have, the set builder, the production manager in the room at the early discussions is that as a designer might start to reveal first sketches or to share first thoughts and trust the people around them enough that they can do that, if somebody then comes and says, well, if you could only modify that idea slightly, we would be able to reuse a staircase from the previous show, or whatever it might be, then we're going to be able to make the show in a more sustainable way. That sort of trust, that sort of collaboration, that acceptance that everybody has expertise that's worth sharing, and that sort of flexibility by a designer who can say, well, yes, of course I can do that, or who might say, no, and here's why. It's really important that it stays that way, and this is why. But it's a respectful and collaborative conversation. That's the atmosphere in which sustainable outcomes become possible. And I don't think compromise is a good way to talk about it, but I do think sharing and collaboration are absolutely fundamental to achieving this.
Yeah, I think there's all of those things require much greater levels of transparency than really are the case in theatre, in most theatre companies and building-based companies in particular. And I think, certainly my experience doing a very small show at the National and completely overawed with, kind of being welcomed into this sort of, hallowed portals and all the rest of it. And going to the production office and them saying to me very earnestly, this is a long time ago, saying very earnestly, now this is the National Theatre and you can have what you need for this production, whatever you want. You have to come up with the ideas, you come up with the design and we'll make it happen. And you kind of went, gosh, that's a huge responsibility to sort of come up with the wonderful thing that they're then going to realize. And then once I started actually getting away and making my little sketch models and my drawings and my this, that, and the other, and I'd come back and they say, well, that's going to take more workshop time than you're allotted. And then it would be, well, the welder, the metal fabricators and welders are busy that week doing so and so. So no, we'd have to buy someone in. So that makes it too expensive. And all of a sudden, the whole thing started whittling down, and you realised that you had no control, that actually you were slotting in to a huge machine, and there was very little transparency in actually how the money was spent and how the whole thing, worked. And you could be as ambitious as you liked, but you then had to start to play a kind of political game as to which bits were more important to sort of keep and to, so I think, that was an experience a long time ago, and hopefully, well, some I know some places it's changed, but do you find that idea of this of transparency being an essential aspect of collaboration is something that it's quite hard to relinquish within companies?
Yes, and I think it's probably more noticeable in large companies. And I don't incidentally think it's that surprising that large companies will both be capable of doing more, but will also be less flexible in how they do it. In a way, that's sort of the nature of the beast with large companies, perhaps. Although I do think a lot of them have tried to and are trying to change. I think that it's been a real privilege for me, and Andrew, you'd probably say the same thing, because I'm not a theatre maker, I'm a semi-outsider, to have spent the whole of last winter in lockdown in the UK, listening to theatre makers of different sorts talking about what you do. And to have week after week a screen full of directors, and then a screen full of designers, and then a screen full of production managers, and a screen full of producers was absolutely fascinating, just as a kind of social experiment, apart from anything else. And the variation in body language, sense of entitlement, and so on between the different, it was a little microcosm of Britain, which is not entirely a good thing, but it was very, very interesting. And I think unless some of what became clear is that theatre is simultaneously, in the UK, and perhaps this isn't true everywhere, is simultaneously the most astonishingly dynamic and creative sector and the most extraordinarily conservative sector in some of its ways of working. And of course, that makes it quite hard to create change. But one thing, and this was a sort of, a piece of thinking that Bura Happold put together, was about how systems change means changing relationships. If you don't change the relationships, you don't change the system. If you don't change the system, you don't change the outcome, and we're not moving towards sustainability in that case. So changing those relationships so that there can be equal and symmetrical conversations across the team, rather than orders being cascaded down from above, is essential if everybody is going to work together to create a sustainable outcome. I sort of also feel that somehow there's an elephant in the Zoom here, which is around the relationship between director and designer.
Yeah, that's the one.
I mean, let's talk about it. And we did have a couple of fascinating just conversations where we got a director and designer, I think we did it twice, who'd worked together a lot to talk about the relationship, which was very, very revealing, I think. And I think in my mind, there's a way in which the visibility of theatre does not reflect the reality of theatre making. And I mean by that we tend to see productions as being made by an author. The writer, if the writer's still alive, or more often the director. And actually both the creative conception of a piece of theatre is clearly much more complicated than that, and the designer has a much more significant role in that, a leading role in that, in a way that isn't often reflected in the conversation around theatre creativity, outside a very small circle. And indeed the craft skills that go into theatre, costume and so on, we're sort of dimly aware of, but are not adequately, don't adequately broadcast the extent to which theatre making depends on those skills. And I think the fact that sustainable making is about rethinking what goes on stage, what it looks like, what it's made of, that, and Andrew's team taught us, is really the heart of the problem. All of that material that 20 years ago would have come from rainforests and ended up in a skip. That's what we're trying to change. And designers are at the heart of that. Designers are making those key decisions. And it follows that the work of designers needs a far higher degree of visibility and understanding than it receives at the moment.
Thank you. We've been trying. Society of British Theatre Designers exhibitions at the V&A have done their bit, but pretty invisible before.
Hey,
yes, Andrew.
You talk about the transparency and an understanding of what everybody does in their role. Absolutely, and the cost transparency. I think all of this needs to be underpinned with really good communication. Communication is a really important part of this. And in my office, in what we do, that where we have good communicating teams, not someone in the team that says no, we can't do that, or no, because we always do it this way. That may well still be pertinent and the case for the relevant response to the question or the challenge. But communication needs to go on beyond that. Everybody has to be inquisitive about everybody else's role and what they do, and why processes are set up in the way they are set up, so that they have the understanding to provide the appropriate challenge to it and to get that system change. So I think transparency, absolutely, but underpinned by really good communication is really important to help facilitate the types of changes that need to happen.
And that needs to start with the top, doesn't it, I suppose? Yeah. Katya, you've got a question. Hi, do you want to unmute? Katya, hi. Yeah? Shai? Do you want to unmute? Unmute.
Hi. Hi. So while we're on the topic of communication, so my question is, what have you learned through working through this in terms of communication? Like, what is the voice you take on? Because that seems to be the problem is, people are really anti in a weird way in which they are pro-environmentalism, but seem to be like you have to be super really passionate about it to actually have an open ear, and people are generally closed off. So what have you learned in literally like the voice that you use to bring these ideas forth in a way in which people are more receptive to hearing? And also, just while I'm speaking, I would just like to state to maybe, I don't know how the meetings were set up within Oistat, but I would love for future meetings in Oistat in which the environmental meetings happen. I would love it if they happened in a way in which they didn't coincide with these other really interesting meetings that, like, I'm sure a lot of people here are double attending, and I understand that, like, they can't happen, that, like, some stuff has to overlap, but it would be great if Oistat made an effort to really prioritize the environmental meetings. But yeah, voice.
Point taken. Thank you.
I think, shall I answer a bit on the communication, which is a really interesting question, I think. It's something that not sure we ever talked about it, but it's just what we've instinctively done with the Theatre Green Book, and I'm really pleased that we have, because I think it's worked really well, is that we've never preached at anyone. We've not seen it as our role to tell people about the climate emergency, or particularly to talk about it. Our attitude has been, we all know perfectly well there's a climate emergency. We've been talking about it for 30 years. We know there's a crisis. You theatre makers know this as well as we do. All we're doing is saying that if you want to make theatre sustainably, this is what it looks like. This is what's involved. And it's up to you to decide how quickly you're able to achieve that. And that means we're not standing on a soapbox shouting at people. We're not trying to tell them that they're bad people and we're good people or anything like that. We're treating people as grown-ups. And I think that we're herd creatures as human beings. At the moment, people haven't been stepping forward because nobody else is stepping forward. You have to be out there to be making sustainable theatre. It's EcoStage. It's the people who've really got it and are committed who are doing it, and they're seen as a real sort of avant-garde. Once you've got the UK's National Theatre making all of their shows in a meaningfully sustainable way, and you've got the National Theatre of Scotland and Wales making shows in a meaningfully sustainable way, and dozens of other companies doing the same thing, then you have a tipping point. Then everybody else is looking around and saying, "Oh my God, we're now the outliers. We're the ones who are not part of the pack." So I think the important thing in creating change is to reach that critical mass where the people who aren't doing it feel like they're the ones who are somehow sticking their necks out. I think we're very close to that. Perhaps we already are there in the UK. And I think, and partly this is, in inverted commas, thanks to COVID, that we've had the time to put this guidance together while theatre makers have not been working on shows. We wouldn't be able to do it now because everybody would be too busy. But the other sort of really important message that Andrew and I kept putting across is this is guidance you can use now and start working with now. I get sort of frustrated, I guess, when I'm on kind of, calls with people who are talking about sustainability, either within the UK or elsewhere, and they're saying, okay, well, we're gonna start gathering some data so we know where we are now. Or they say, we're just going to start exploring some different methodologies, or we're going to start raising consciousness, and we'll aim to start doing some sustainable shows in 2 years' time. Really, what are you waiting for? It's not that hard. And, we have collectively and collaboratively made the only tool you really need, and it's not a particularly complicated one. This is not rocket science. You're not waiting for an invention. You're reusing and recycling more. That's it. And here's what you need to do to make sure you can achieve the outcomes with that. And so I think putting it on a plate like that and saying, no, you're not waiting for anything. You don't have to gather data. You don't have to invent a new role or employ a new person. You can make your next show in this way. And here's the guidance for it. It's the final part of the communication message. It's about saying, actually just start.
Mm. So it's essentially practical, isn't it? It's talking in practicalities rather than actually having the high conversation all the time.
Yeah, it's that, and I'm sort of going on just because thoughts are occurring to me, but Andrew or Paul, do shut me up and jump in instead. The other thing that I think was really important, and I said that at our first discussion, Andrew and I and the others who were on it divided theatre into 3 sections: buildings, productions, operations. I think it's really important to set tasks at an achievable level. One of the blockers you have in conversations with people about sustainable theatre and performance is they say, it's all just so complicated, it's all interwoven. Should I be focusing on audience travel or on the building or on production? And, I can start using LED lighting, but is that more important, or is it more important than we start using recycled plywood? And I think one of the things that we've tried to do with the Theatre Green Book is disentangle some of those different strands which have become unhelpfully woven together. So if you say, okay, it's about production and everything to do with production, lighting, sound, costumes, props, sets, here's what you need to do with it. So giving people visible and manageable targets is also an aspect of communication that fingers crossed seems to have worked really well. Andrew, do you want to sort of pitch in on that as well?
Yes, and I only to say that I think that picture that you were describing often came about because there was a sustainability champion in an organization. It fell on one person's shoulder, or it falls on one person's shoulder, and the way, as you described, the three volumes within that, very clear things which everybody could access, and it's across everybody in the organization has a route in to make a contribution and affect change is really important. And I'm chuffed with the feedback that we've got, and I think that the methodology is bearing fruit because we have organizations that are advocates for this now, and the more people and the more organizations that are advocates for this, we're trying to set up a snowball effect of more people wanting to adopt this, and we're very open to say we might not have got everything perfect. and it's an online publication that we're committed to review and update and develop through time, because what we need to achieve as a society is going to escalate, is going to need to, this is not a we've done it type thing. In 3 years time we'll have done it. In 3 years time we'll be in a different situation and need to potentially be upping their ante and achieving more.
I've got millions of questions I could ask you, but I think we need to invite some more questions. I can see that Monique has already written about education institutions. Does that go as far as, does that go for directors as well? It's not just the theatre design and production courses.
I mean, it's growing at the moment, and this came out of a few, very committed and interested people working within universities who happened, I think, all to be on the design side, and who've been talking about sustainability, getting in touch. And then we got together an education group, which is mixed, but I think probably design courses are the leading ones. And that's now got a real head of steam of its own, and we've put together some resources around theatre education, which are now in this education section of the website. And it's also starting to stretch through to student groups as well. So I think that we're at the start of spreading it through the theatre and drama schools. Whether it's reached directors' courses, I don't know, but I'm sure it will. They've only just gone, it's only the beginning of term, they've just gone back. And I think we are sort of starting to reach people who are creating curriculums, people who are at the heads of schools, in ways that will be helpful. I mean, again, sort of behind what you're saying is the skepticism and worry about directors getting on board, which I don't think is unreasonable.
No, I don't want to sound old-fashioned about that, really. I think it's quite astonishing how ignorant, it's certainly in the UK, many of the directing students, graduates are of actually the production process or the design process. And so there's an assumption of the, auteur sort of mantle that I think is kind of introduced really quite early, unfortunately, at a very formative time. And I think that's probably a very important area to crack.
The same is true of architects.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not, Andrew will agree with this.
I'm sure. Andrew, can I ask a little bit more about the area that that is difficult on perhaps the production side, which is storage and reuse of amazingly specifically created engineering solutions for productions, and how is that a matter of carbon calculators and those sorts of sums, or do you think are you working with engineers as well in other companies, and can you see a way of kind of bringing that in?
Is this carbon storage or storage of sets, props, and everything that goes into making a show?
I suppose it's both, in that it's the actual making, the consumption of of energy in making the stuff, the amount of that, and then actually how one stores it or reuses it or thinks of it in that sense, because there's sets, as you say, with timber, you can go, well, if you just decrease the size of that bit, we could do it out of so many 8x4 sheets, that would be better, or you can sort of do that. But when it comes to bespoke sort of metal structures, it sort of feels harder.
Yes, certainly. So a few things there, and maybe at the end of this, Paddy can maybe give a little bit more detail. But there are organisations looking at trying to standardise modules of for scenery and sets that can facilitate easier storage, but also repeatability and reuse. And I think that would be a significant, well, I know would be a significant step. Anything which allows a standardization as a substrate, if you like, that can then still have the same level of a level of flexibility and creativity applied to it, talking in abstract terms here, but it is beneficial. We talk about in sustainability the boundary of the system. Sorry to get a bit technical here, but
that's great.
The greater impact you can have is when you increase that boundary and you get the system changes beyond just an individual or an organization, and therefore, when you're starting to look at the circular economy, which is effectively the reuse of every component that goes into a production, being able to share and collaborate across organizations is really important to get significant impact and change. I am completely aware in every theatre I've designed and every existing theatre I've been into, storage is always inadequate, and it's probably in the design process of the buildings. It's the bit which always is when we're trying to get things in on budget that hits the cutting room floor, unfortunately. So I think that there is a case for centralised materials banks, if you like, that community of theatres can get access to. And I think the game changer on that, as I see with work that we do in the museums and gallery sector, is the digitisation of everything. So using databases and being able to digitally access the materials bank, so that you're taking, that will facilitate a different approach to design. Now, I'm not saying that everybody would love the challenge of I'm only going to design a show based on what's in the database or in the materials bank, but it can lead to interesting and valuable outcomes. But is certainly the game changer as far as that using less new virgin materials.
Yes, I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise, should it? Because for touring theatre, that was always part of the game, was actually looking up your tour, looking up the theatres on your tour, looking at the widths of prosceniums and the depths of the stage, and checking that your set would fit, or how it could fit, or what you had to do to it so that it could do the get-ins in the right amount of time, and all the rest of it to fit that number of theatres. So that kind of standardization, if you like, isn't new.
It's applying it to the challenge of reducing impact and reducing the embodied carbon. And I think that there are so many of these sort of historic processes that just need to be reimagined to address the challenge of repurposing and reducing impact within the theatre world.
It's sort of interesting. Somebody on some call, I remember once saying how the real challenge in reusing and recycling more of the material that goes on sets is in the middle of the stage. When you look at the proscenium arch, if it's a Pros Arch theatre, everything below that is probably steel deck, or it's going to be standard floors that you can reuse, and everything above is technical theatre, which is all modularized and made of reusable components, and the tricky bits in the middle. And the challenge is then to what extent one can start to standardize that. And the two things that Andrew's mentioned are first modular framing systems and modular design. And the Royal Opera House, going back to opera, is working on a system at the moment which they will make open source for people to use.
Yeah.
And the second challenge is about making, this is something we learned from set builders, is about making sets in ways that you can take them to bits without having to destroy them. In other words, the kind of fixings you use, the kind of joints you use, the kind of glues you use are ones that you can demount so that you can reuse the materials again. The point about storage is a really interesting one, and we have followed through on it. So I know that the theatres in Manchester have got an initiative running, and this is something where citywide initiatives are really valuable.
Brilliant.
To create a shared storage facility where everybody can see what each other has and use more of it. There's something a bit similar in Glasgow, and the Greater London Authority commissioned us to do a study into a reuse and recycling facility and what that would look like. If we can have much more storage, then it's far easier for designers to find the materials to reuse and recycle. It has to be, there is a question here, of course, about intellectual property. People can't just reuse whole sets, at least not without permission. But if you're talking about generic components, staircases, windows, doors, flats, floors, and if you're talking about materials, plywood, steel, then that doesn't come into play quite so much. I think I was also, Andrew, really interested that you're talking about digital systems and sharing, which also are really important. And one of the other sort of initiatives that we've been talking about is to try and get more theatres within the UK to manage their storage using software that everybody, including freelancers and small companies, can look into so that they can see what's out there and arrange to borrow or hire it. And that, of course, is a huge way of spreading resource through the sector from large companies down to freelancers and small companies, which everybody is up for if we can find ways to get the software out there.
Yeah, and to fund the people. Abby, I can see your hand. Can I just say to people, if you've got a question and you don't mind putting your digital hand up, that makes it easier for me to see. That would be great. Abby, please do.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you very much for the amazing presentations and discussions of absolutely relevant themes, and we need to discuss more and more. I was, because Kate mentioned about the touring, and I've been listening all you've been saying, and been buzzing in my mind, how does it affect in the global scale? Because when you talk about, touring festivals, bringing your own identity, bringing traces of your locality into the festival or gathering point, how does it affect when we standardize everything? And another thing is, doesn't possibly enlarge the distance between more developed countries and less developed countries in technology resources, and so how do we, it's a big discussion, but I just wanted to drop on the table to hear a little bit about your thoughts about this.
Paddy, Andrew?
I'm happy to, picking up on the sort of number of points in there, I think touring is a really, really interesting one. Oddly, we're just getting a sort of touring group together around the Theatre Green Book to talk about best practice for touring. And of course, there are countries, we tend to think about, based in the UK, we tend to think about domestic touring within the UK or touring within the rest of Europe. But I was talking the other day to somebody based in Australia where touring is they're talking about vast distances. And the only practical way to tour is by aeroplane, because they don't have a railway system that cuts across the middle of the country. Yeah. So touring, and Canada, I think, is very much the same. It's really challenging. We were having a touring group meeting 2 days ago, And there's a big international show somebody was talking about, which is starting in London and going on a tour around the United States. And it's cheaper, financially cheaper, to put everything into containers in London, all the lights that are available in the UK, in the USA, rigging, truss, which is available in the USA, but to rig it all in London, put it in containers, ship it across the Atlantic, and then having played in New York, put it in lorries and drive it coast to coast to play in California. That's cheaper, financially cheaper than making the show anew in each place. They're not happy about that. Nobody's happy about it, but that is currently the financial reality of touring a complex show. Now, there are a number of things you can do, and I think something that we've learned from the Theatre Green Book is that one isn't always looking for, a single dramatic answer which solves everything. You're looking at a series of things which make things incrementally better. So somewhere in there is, and Andrew was making the point earlier that we don't think we have all the answers, and that's really true of touring. I don't think we've got anywhere close to the good answers yet, but the sort of conversations we're having are around designing for touring. Kate was talking about this a minute ago, being aware that if a show is going on tour, the less stuff you can put in the lorries, the better. Thinking about procuring in advance, thinking about designing generically. Somebody on the same call was talking in, I was bringing up, I think this is a really good example, so bear with me. I brought up Chuck Berry. When Chuck Berry went on tour, and I saw him playing in London in 1980, when he went on tour, he didn't tour with a band. It was part of his contract that every town he went to needed to provide a bassist and a drummer who knew all of Chuck Berry's songs. And because Chuck Berry's songs are all the same, that wasn't particularly difficult. And that's a really good example of, if you're touring something generic, then it's easy to do it again and again in place to place without having to carry any physical stuff with you. As soon as you make something that's very, very bespoke, then you have to take the musicians and the kit. An example of that in this world is that I'm told that when comedians go on tour in stand-up comedy, they don't take their lights with them. They just say, it's part of the contract that we have 4 lights of a certain sort, color change lights of a certain sort. And I'm not a lighting designer. I don't know how you describe it, but there are ways to do that. And that's a model for theatre. If lighting designers for touring shows are able, and perhaps they won't always be, but perhaps they will, are able to design generic rigs that can be found in each town, then you don't have to carry the technical set with you. So that's all I'm giving a snapshot of, is the conversations around sustainable touring rather than any conclusions, because nobody's reached really good conclusions yet. And the other thing just to bear in mind is that touring, at least within regions, as we move towards hydrogen or electric vehicles, may become less damaging. This may be a temporary problem. So and the other thing is that there are real benefits to touring in that the same show, the same set, is going to be seen by more people. And it's going to have, therefore, more viewings, if you like. So we don't want to dismantle touring networks and say touring must stop. But the more people can creatively explore how to tour and how to tour in a lightweight way, the more answers we'll have to what remains, I think, a really, really serious and important challenge.
Abby, does that?
Yeah, can I just make a comment? Because I can totally understand about the generic performance kind, and you can use local material, and more I think I've been changing my way of thinking as a designer to consider, when I'm going to work somewhere else and bringing my project somewhere else, what I'm bringing to what I'm leaving behind when I go to another country, that kind of things. And as an example, when I did the exhibition 2011 for the PQ, using a material that unique exists in Brazil, I shipped the entire container 20-foot container from Brazil to, was 20 or 40, was 40 was a larger one, full of this material. There's a wooden boards they're used for shuttering, but they go through a phenolic process that make them all pink. And it sounds, and I needed to work the material in the material itself. I didn't want to make a representation of the material. And I always like, as a designer, working that way. I like to use the real material. And then after that experience, then because I traveled to UK, then to Prague, then to Portugal, then to UK, back to Brazil. And I thought that was quite insane, because in the theme of under the theme of the sustainability, it's not just the material you bring, but the bugs you bring with, as much as you use chemicals to demifugate and to clean up all the bugs, then you transport here and there. That's an obligation by transport, by air or by ship, by sea. I thought that was, that might not be meeting the requirements of sustainability that we are going through for the next decade or the rest of our life. So I start thinking differently on the way that how can I use local materials that can just be reused in that and on its own place. But when you work in exhibitions, when you work in theatre, sometimes you have some situations like that. People want to bring some specific materials, some specific components that is related to their identity, that brings a bit of their identity from, whatever they are. And that's, I think, is a tricky thing. Of course, we can, set something and create an entire virtual experience of that. But it's something to discuss, to think how can we combine what the limits of that and how we designers work with those challenges as well. Combining identity, materials, mobility, sustainability, and different regulations in different countries. Because until we get a unique and a global, let's say, regulations, it will be different to each one.
One thing, and I know there are some other hands up, but just one quick sort of thought from what you were saying, Abby, is, and this came out of the touring conversation we were having yesterday, is that some of the biggest shows that tour, designers, when they're designing them, don't know that they're going to become touring shows, because it's only after they've been a success on Broadway or in London or wherever that the decision is made to tour them. So it's not always in the brief for the designer to design for touring. And then, of course, you can't change the show because that's what people want to see. So that's another aspect of the challenge, I think.
Can I just, yes, I shouldn't say. I am going to say, but that's going back to Andrew, what Andrew was saying, that's part of the discussion that you have, or the equation, isn't it, about where the sustainability is in that whole scheme. So that it might be that those boards, for instance, go back onto a building site when you go back into their day job, or the fact that exhibition was on tour for so very long that actually it managed to go to a large number of people, and the cost of building it anew in each place would have taken a different amount of construction and management and all the rest of it and finishing. So once you start, I know we're talking about hindsight, but once you start to sort of break it down in different ways, I suppose there's different ways of looking at the sustainability of it. Am I correct, Andrew? Is that?
Yes, I think touring the boundary of the whole system becomes that much bigger. Again, sorry, talking in sort of sustainability theory terms, and therefore needs a bit more exploration of consequences of different decision making. There isn't a hard and fast, this is every touring show should consider doing it this way. You're introducing a whole suite more variables. So I think it's having more time to consider the different inputs to the system and the different outputs, again talking generically, but I think the principle of what's the end of life for the materials still applies. And if there's still an end of life that is valuable, and we talk about material hierarchy all the way through, it's not we'll chip it down and it will become a biofuel, but how can it have a future life in its current form, is really important in that context. As Paddy says as well, this is why it's so incredibly complex. Some forms of travel are being decarbonised, and that is also, in the future, that may well also make some forms of touring, as Paddy was saying, that particularly the local touring, far less impactful. There's no one size fits all. It is but the upskilling yourself, having everybody aware of the challenge and everybody collectively thinking through the potential solutions, is you're making big leaps forward on it.
Yeah. Very quickly, Imogen, is Imogen gone, or is she still here? She had her hand up.
I'm still here.
Imogen, hi.
Hi.
You have a
I
question.
put my hand back down again because I thought, we might have moved on a little bit from what my original hand up was about. But it was just in relationship to touring. And it's interesting, Paddy, that what you just said about, it's not the common thing yet. But my experience in Australia is that touring is now almost de rigueur. It's what most contracts for designers will have, a touring clause. And I know that for at least the last 6 years, every design I have to design with touring in mind. And they say that post-COVID lockdowns, we're just coming out of another 3 or 4 month one. It's probably going to become standard for designers to have to design for touring, because if the show gets shut down before opening night or gets shut down quickly, the idea is that it will all go into storage, and it's been planned that if COVID happens, things will go into storage, and then it will have to tour to make money. And that is how it will work. And so I just wanted to sort of throw that in there, that I think there may be some new models of making theatre that will come out of the COVID pandemic, that is about how do theatre companies and producers make money, given that it's an even bigger gamble now to put the money into making the show, knowing it could actually all end up, never, the curtain never raises, which is what's happened to numerous shows here.
That's really interesting. And of course, it's really worth clinging to the fact that touring is a fantastic thing. Touring makes shows more available. It allows people to share it. Theatre is a sort of, is not unique, or performance is sort of rare, in that until digital and broadcast came along, you had to be there to see it. Books you can buy anywhere, music you can hear recordings anywhere, and so on. But it's only if you can tour shows that people can get to see them and to share them. So it's a really important one to keep, part of theatre to keep alive, I think. And it's really important that we keep working together to find the most sustainable possible ways of achieving it.
Yeah. Chai, thank you, Andrew. Chai, would you like to? Yeah. You're mute, I think. Hello? You're very quiet.
How's this? I know I already asked a question. I just want to make sure no one else has a question.
No, please ask, but
Okay.
speak up, because you've gone very quiet.
I will change my microphone sensitivity level. Microphone sensitivity. Okay, I'm gonna just speak up. So it's really exciting to hear about your talking about community storage. Having like a warehouse which is shared amongst a bunch of theaters has actually been like one of my main dreams for years. And so I would love to become a part of that if there are projects which are already happening. But to talk about that, it would be beautiful if there was like a warehouse which was like IKEA or like Home Depot, where there's just tons of storage, and that theaters probably bigger productions can just donate their stuff, and that maybe educational theaters and small-time theaters. I'm an artist and a small-time theater creator. I'm working on a puppet show right now. Budget is a really big problem for me. Like all theaters trash is my treasure, and there are so many artists which just really want theaters trash. We want your trash so bad, and there's like all these problems where I'm like, oh, should I go to a scene shop and just go through their wood scraps because they go through so much, and wondering about whether theaters should be really trying to connect with scene shops, which are specifically trying to do sustainable practices. Because talking to technical directors and working in scenic shops, I've just had so many frustrating experiences in which they're just like, just throw it away, just do it again, throw it away. And I know professional scenic shops do less waste because people are making better cuts, but they're trash. And like even like fabric scraps, and to just like communitize and share, just if like theaters, I don't know where the money would come from. I would be happy to write like grants or something, but like for all theaters, because then even big productions, artists, would be able to get more, because they could just say, hey, well, a bunch of this stuff, my theater doesn't have it in stock, but I can rent it for cheap, because I'm actually putting on a production that's going to make a lot of money and people are going to get paid, but that they're able to do more of what they love and more of what they want to do, and aren't being restricted by stupid stuff that has already been made, that people are like, I don't know what to do with this. And, like I was in high school theater, like, not too long ago. And, like any donation, we have had so few donations from big theaters, but that made the absolute world of a difference. And I think having in like all cities, like not all cities, but like a lot of cities, I'm in New York City, it's ridiculous. There should be a warehouse, even if it's like just outside the city, in which artists, because then it like does top-down promotion to artists being able to have accessibility to materials, and that is just such a dream.
Agreed.
What is the work that's being done on that, and thoughts on that, please?
Do you not have materials for the arts in New York City?
We do. It's more like communitized mass, like theaters coming together for storage, or like just to put, like, say they're like, we can't store these flats anymore, so they get rid of them, which I know so many theaters do. And also just like materials, like I'm serious, like really cheap free materials. There are ways in which you can get it, but it's just like, I feel like it needs to be centralized, because it becomes such an effort for, artists to find these materials. Like for me, I'm trying to make this show, and, a lot of my scrap wood I'll be able to get by going through people's trash. But like for me to buy just like one sheet of plywood, it's a big expense for me. And I know people throw away like half sheets, like that would make the world of a difference for me. And there's so many people who are like me, in which literally like a 2x4, I'm like scared to budget 2x4 into my materials costs, and I don't want to, because I know it exists. I know it's in people's trash. It seems stupid.
Okay, I agree. There are resources, but we need to certainly gather more information about all the ones available in different cities. It's true. So a good point, and yes, it needs developing. Paul, I'm very aware that we're right sort of towards the end now, the session, and you haven't said a lot of the really valuable stuff that you need to, that you wanted to say. So I do apologize. So I'm going to give the rest of the session to Paul. That's okay.
I'm not quite sure when we need to be finished by, 'cause I think it's scheduled for kind of now.
How long have we
if
got,
I just try and be really brief.
Won-Young, how long have we got?
We have 1 minute left.
Oh no, really? Is that because it'll cut out?
Well, we can stay a little bit longer, but then I have to move to the next section. The next section starts in 10 minutes.
Okay, so can we stay for 10 minutes?
Yes, you can do that. But I will leave it here. And then I need to join the other section.
Okay.
I can be really quick.
Thank you very much.
I mean, I think if what I do, I had prepared something rather longer, but I think if what I do is I run down my bullet points and invite people to follow up with me with anything that they're interested in, then I think I can I can get through very quickly. So first, I do want to just come back to the point about voice, because I think it's really important, and I kind of want to acknowledge the lack of representation really in the environmental movement and the theatre industry and the intersection of both. And also say something we've been really looking at in terms with EcoStage about how we talk about things. We're very aware that, you know, you can kind of eat fruit and only wear secondhand clothes, and, you know, and be criticized, and your voice can be dismissed for being a hippie, or you can not do those things and you get called a hypocrite, and it's an incredibly difficult path to weave. So I just wanted to come back to that point, because I just think it's very, very important. The Sbtd working group, as I say, it's about representing designers. What we have a few areas of that we're interested in. Materials, we were looking at creating a database, and we found that, you know, there's a lot of practical reasons not to, that designers shouldn't be doing that we're perhaps not best place for that, but we're testing samples of materials that claim to be sustainable. And we have a costume subgroup there's a whole story about an attempt to set up a costume store and shared costume store that designers would pay a sort of small subscription for in London, which lasted a few years, and then it failed through lack of space. So we're looking at models for getting that going again. We have regular meetings that are open to everyone, not just Sbtd members. So get in touch if you would. They're in UK evening time, so obviously not for everyone, but they are widely open to discuss things. We have guest speakers or just talk about topics. And we are developing, there's various other things, and we are looking at this issue of shared storage and shared materials, and talking to, it's UK specific information, so I won't go into it, but there are groups that are working on that. And we're also developing carbon literacy training that relates specifically to stuff, so set, costume, things like that, and would be carbon literacy training specifically for, therefore, designers, makers, production managers, people who deal with that kind of production stuff. And part of that, we realized that we need to better make the argument as to why this matters in theatre, because, you know, compared with air travel and meat consumption, we're relatively small. And so we put out a call for videos from theatre makers to talk about this, sort of do talking heads. And the responses we got from that were that that's not, you know, a lot of people don't have time to do that, or aren't quite in a place to do that. We teamed up with EcoStage, which, full disclosure, I'm also on, to extend this video call to make something a bit more broad and open, which would be an archive of videos that we're planning to share at World Stage Design in a year's time. Then EcoStage got a slot at the People's Summit, which is a big fringe event around COP26, the Global Climate Summit. So we've kind of sped up the call. We'll still be working towards a much bigger archive of videos for World Stage Design. But for COP26, any videos that people want to contribute by then, we'll create an archive. We will show that, perhaps in the form of a brief trailer of excerpts. We haven't quite worked that out because we only got the go-ahead for being part of the COP26 a few days ago. But we would love to have videos that are either existing videos, or you could just talk to camera about what your interest, you know, how your work is being affected by climate change directly, or through trying to mitigate it through your work. It could be a piece of work already made. It's a really open call. I will put the link in the chat. And I did just also want to say a few words about EcoStage, which I can do equally quickly, I think.
You're fine.
EcoStage, so initially it was essentially this pledge to principles. We're now adding kind of resources and things like that. But the principles broadly I wanted to share, which was the first one is around sort of, we might call conventional sustainability, so circular economy, all those sorts of things, reusing, you know, designing for disposal. The second is on well-being and how that relates. The third is on our relationship with nature, which is really interesting. It's really interesting in relation to lots of these questions, how we talk about nature, how we learn from nature. Then the next is about co-creativity and collaboration, which we think, you know, this point comes back to the earlier point about collaboration. We think that's, you know, a central point. We also ask people to pledge to be a change maker of sorts, although of course that doesn't necessarily mean having to stand on a soapbox and expose yourself in that way, but to be some kind of change maker, to support social justice, in which we talk about the idea of deep democracy quite a lot, which is really interesting. Again, I won't go into it right now. We'll be doing lots of presentations and things on this, so there'll be a lot more. And then finally, to build a positive legacy. So they're the EcoStage principles that we're going to be asking people to pledge to. And then on the website, you can share your case studies and have a profile and things like that. So, and it will be under EcoStage that we'll be sharing these, most of these video, the video archive, but also drawing from it as an educational tool for carbon literacy training with Sbtd. So that's my that's a whistle stop version.
Paul, how long do the videos need to be, or how short?
10 minutes, but it could be an excerpt from something much longer. Right. And they could already be out there. You could just send us a link and we'll embed it, or you could send us a video and we'll upload it to the EcoStage YouTube channel. We basically want to be as open about this as possible so that we can fit as many people in as many different ways, and be as inclusive as possible. So, but there are details on the call out site, which I had ready to go, and of course I've now lost the link to, but I have it just, we'll have it in a second.
Okay. Fantastic.
Yeah. So that's, yes. So hopefully that sort of covers the key things in a very brief way. But I'm absolutely happy to chat. You can get hold of me. There's a link I put in earlier for the Sbtd group, and I look after the emails for that group. Or via EcoStage, there's a EcoStage site. So I am colleagues are very easy to get hold of, and very happy to follow up on any or all of this. I'm just doing the link now.
Okay.
Good. And hopefully we'll get some videos.
Yeah. So
ideally before November, we're presenting on, we're launching EcoStage, we're launching the reboot of EcoStage on the 9th of November at COP.
Right, so you need them a little bit before then.
I think, or the 10th, 9th.
So there's lots of really useful things in the chat, people. So do save your chat into your Finder folder, or whatever, and sort of work through those different links. Would be really good. I think we probably have got to get to an end. Paddy, is there anything you finally want to say?
No, thank you very much for coming along to this. And I mean, I suppose I just want to end on a note of real optimism about theatre. I'm not going to pretend I feel optimistic about the planet, but I do feel optimistic about theatre's ability to change. One of Andrew's colleagues said to me at one point, I think in response to one of the brilliant conversations we'd had with theatre makers, that it would be really hard if we were trying to change an industry like aviation or whatever, but this is theatre, and it's an industry which is innately creative and innately dynamic and innately embraces new ways of doing things. And in light of that, I do feel really optimistic that theatre at least can move towards a more sustainable future.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrew, do you have anything? Do you contribute anything?
I only to share Paddy's optimism and to express how impressed I've been with the enthusiasm and energy that has gone into the not only helping create the Theatre Green Book, but the response to it. And I think the industry is and this process can be seen as trailblazing for many others that need to follow suit on this. And I think we need to continue to work hard, but not be frustrated that we haven't yet reached our nirvana on this, but not safe in the knowledge that continued and sustained effort with the tools and a creative response, it is not just process, will get us there, and we should then be shouting about this so that others can follow suit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And Paul, thank you very much. for all of that. And
Absolute
yes,
pleasure.
Please, people, get your thoughts, your videos in. I'm just going to make a plea to this, that this government needs to invest in education and training and in people, really, because that seems to be the key thing, is to invest in people as sustainable. And that's a whole other conversation, which we won't have now. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for coming to this. It's been really, really enjoyable, really informative. And I hope we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.